Welcome to Planet Poet Words in Space. I'm your host, Sharon Israel, and I'm so happy to welcome back Tina Barry to the show. She's here to discuss her spellbinding new book, I Tell Henrietta. And Kristin Flynn, the artist who created the beautifully expressive cover and interior art for I Tell Henrietta, also joins us. Hi, Tina. Hi, Kristin.
Hi, Sharon.
Thanks so much for being here. We have a lot to talk about. But before we start, let me read your bios, okay? Tina Barry is a textile designer turned poet, short fiction writer, and editor. She is the author of I Tell Henrietta, Aim Higher Inc. 2024, with art by Kristin Flynn. Beautiful Raft and Mall Flower, Big Table Publishing, 2019 and 2016. Her writing can be found in Rattle, Verse Daily, One Art, a Journal of Poetry, SWWIM, the Indianapolis Review, the Best Small Fictions 2020 Spotlighted Story, and 2016, and elsewhere. Tina has 5 Pushcart Prize nominations and several Best of the Net and Best Microfiction nods. Tina teaches at the Poetry Barn and Writers.com. Kristin Flynn earned a BFA in fashion design from Parsons School of Design, an AAS degree in textiles from Rochester Institute of Technology, and studied painting at Mariel Hearst University in Portland, Oregon. Her paintings and drawings have been exhibited in numerous group and solo shows, including the Cheryl McGinnis Gallery, Stone Ridge Center for the Arts, Jane Street Gallery, Studio 89, Brick Gallery, Kingston Museum of Contemporary Art, and Bard College. That's a lot of degrees and accomplishments between the two of you. So, Tina, I'm going to ask you to open the show with you reading one of your poems from the book called Questioning the Lake. This is from section 5, The Upside of Loss.
Questioning the lake. Not language, not the thrill of switching dumb with wonder to wonderdom. No, what rolls beneath my words is the first lake I swam in, the terror of its dark water. I had only known the burbling aqua of pools, shallow in their openness, and then this lapping oval, its brow of tan stones. Why did Henrietta's question evoke the lake, its image lodged now like the shadow of a lover's hand? Perhaps to cling to pleasure after months of famine, to feel the lake's fleecy bottom, how its cool fingers circled my neck but never let me drown.
That's Tina Barry reading her poem, Questioning the Lake, from her book, I Tell Henrietta. It's so poignant. And you talk about after months of, what did you say? After months of
Famine.
And could you describe the poignant, sad nature of the poem for us?
Well, I started writing the poems for I Tell Henrietta shortly after a young relative of mine suffered a stroke. And when that happened, it threw my family, and at that time too, my mother, who was in her late 90s, was suffering some terrible health issues. So we really felt like we were drowning. So yeah, I couldn't write for a few months, but when I started, the sort of the image of a lake floated into my consciousness, and it became a metaphor. The feeling of being underwater, literally being underwater. What water can do for you, the way it can soothe. So the water became important and sort of kind of floats through many of the poems throughout the book. So That's how it launched.
And of course, the swans are floating on the water. They live on the water. And the imagery is beautiful. The detail about the pool, the aqua pool, and how safe it was. But then the lake that can be very dangerous becomes a refuge.
Right.
And Kristin, I wanted to ask you, choosing the imagery for this illustration, could you describe how you came upon this image and describe it for us? We're a radio show. Unfortunately, we can't show your beautiful artwork, but it's an image of a woman with gray hair saving it seems a younger woman with blonde hair.
I'm also a lover of lakes and water. Just the idea of the two women floating and the older woman consoling the younger
Uh-huh.
swimming was just so powerful to me. And the lake, for me, the water became sort of like a protective womb that they could come together.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it was a wonderful thing to be able to draw that and pull it off. So
It works beautifully with Tina's wonderful poem. So Tina, would you read the prologue, the poem from the prologue called My Year of Drawing Swans for us?
My year of drawing swans. When the need to render a beak lived inside me, I'd swing one arm around a subway pole, press the lead point of the pencil into the notebook I carried. A dark dot launched the curve of hard bill. Between its eyes, the black knob, gateway to the swoosh of neck. Stashes of swan studied filled the drawer of my bedside table. I'd wake to the sky slouching off its cape and label their parts, a new language I couldn't stop writing. Lure, nars, covert, its ledge of wings, the serrated lamella surrounding its tongue. At jobs I loathed, I'd peek at torn pieces stuffed into folders, darken a wing, shadow the water. Once I had perfected the dusty diamond of its foot, the center digit so real I could feel its scalloped ridges with my finger. I stood in the subway, poised to draw, but the swans never returned to me.
That's Tina Barry reading her poem, My Year of Drawing Swans, which opens her book, I Tell Henrietta. So interesting how this fantastical imagery that you have throughout the book starts in the subway. I find that contrast very interesting.
So I kind of lived on the subway.
there you are.
Sure, and those, right? If you're in the city, you have to take the subway twice a day. Could you talk about a little bit about how you started this book? There's so many things to discuss. Why swans?
Well, I ask myself that a lot. It's still something I think I'm trying to figure out. The story, that's a true story about me being obsessed about drawing years ago when I spent a lot of time drawing. And I think then I was a designer. So I think that, looking at a swan, there was something beautiful, it's just an interesting shape. It's stunning. I think of it, I wrote in one of the poems that I saw it as a feathered yacht. And that's kind of
it's great.
the brand with its big body and that long, odd, slender neck. So there's that. There's a myth around swans. There's that whole dark side to swans. If you see them, they don't play nicely in the
No,
water.
they're nasty. They're nasty. They hiss at you.
They're big bullies in the water.
So there's this dichotomy about it, and you talk about, you have a lot of light and dark in your poems, and the swan to you brings that out. I find that interesting because it's Tchaikovsky, Odile, and Odette, the the good swan and the evil swan.
Well, you can't think of a swan without those two sides, right?
Right, right. But you make the swan your own. It's I forget about the Tchaikovsky. This is yours. This swan. You also talked about how a Russian folk tale hovers over, like the mortar imagery floats through the book, and this Russian folk tale hovers over the story. Could you talk a little bit about that?
It hovers really over all of the stories. And during COVID, during early COVID, I started working on a book about a Russian immigrant. When I was researching, I came across this folk tale about this Tsarina. So this Tsarina was a real nightmare. She has a terribly cruel. She was physically repulsive to the people around her.
Mhm,
She
mhm.
like a very prominent black mustache. Um, and when she found out that this lovely young couple were about to marry, she had artisans in the area carve a giant swan out of ice and force them to sleep inside it on their wedding night.
How cruel.
So she was, and and one of I think it was the wife who died. So, that swan too is, this magnificent, I'm sure I imagine it as being, but its job was really to destroy them.
Yes.
So that I think has colored many of the stories in the book.
Mhm. I need to ask you, who is Henrietta?
Oh, well, everybody asks that. So there is a real Henrietta. The Henrietta in my book really served as a confidant and also as as a portal, as sort of a kind ear.
Oh yeah, I feel her presence in the book, and it's such a fantastic umbrella and portal for anything you want to say, to pour your heart out in this way. Kristen, talk about the cover art, which is describes the prologue poem. It's very beautiful. You have gray tones and pink tones on the face, but with gray contours. But what's most important about this is what her hair. Could you describe what it's like?
Yes, there's a swan on top of this woman's head, kind of almost like a hat, but not really a hat. So actually, I only painted and drew birds for about 5 years of
Oh,
my. I was obsessed with them, and actually, they showed up in my life. I literally had a freezer full of dead birds, and I would pull them out and put them in little scenarios in my studio, in little still lifes while they were frozen, and paint from them. So
No idea.
it was
No
an
idea.
obsession. Had a Cooper's hawk, I had sparrows, I had bluebirds, I had robins, I had cardinals, and I would find them on the roads and in the woods, and then people started giving them to me.
wow.
Got a little curtailed when we had a power shortage for 5 days. And I had this freezer full of birds that were melting. So I put them all out in the woods, and they became dinner for some other.
There's a poem for you, Tina. That's wild. Thank you, Kristen. Tina, would you read? Speaking of other critters each eating the defrosted birds, your poem from section one called I Mentioned the Deer.
I mentioned the deer. I preferred my friend's father. Mine sat silent in cigar smoke, suave in a cheap suit. Hers, a suburban cowboy, weather-worn in plaid flannel, loud with love. "All girl," he'd say when I visited, patting my cheek. "You're so darn cute." On warm evenings, he'd walk with my friend, head bent to listen, one hand holding their mudsliesh, the other hand around hers. Around 6 p.m. each night, I'd listen for his truck, then part the bedroom curtains to watch its slow descent. The truck made happy music, a jangle of rusted lawn mowers and car parts, watering cans and bits of bicycles. My affection for him changed one night, though, when instead of odds and ends, a huge buck, eyes paralyzed in surprise, antlers shocked with blood, filled the truck's bed. I didn't want to believe that he had killed the animal, or walked to the swing set and unhooked the swings, or, joined by 3 neighborhood men who patted him on the back, hung the deer's from its hooves like a desecrated god.
It's Tina Barry reading I Mention the Deer from her book, I Tell Henrietta. This poem really gets to me. The disappointment, but when it mentions in the beginning, of course, I preferred my friend's father. That sets it all up, and then you have another fall from grace from another father figure. Talk about that a little bit, and the desecrated god.
I adored my father growing up as a child.
Mm-hmm.
But he was very quiet. He could be very distant and disengaged from the family. So I was always kind of jealous of friends who had fathers that were affectionate, that were talkers, that were fun. And this girl who lived right across the street from me, that was her father. So he was very special to me, and I felt that I was special to him too.
Yes.
That's who he was. That's who he was to all the kids in the family. So when I saw him hang this deer from the swing set, which is still in my mind.
My God.
Horrific things. It was a little suburban neighborhood with starter homes. So this deer hanging from a swing set was like another house that was just built. It was incredibly upsetting.
It's so grotesque. It's not like there was the deer apparatus that hunters usually use. He improvised, but to desecrate a child's swing set like that.
I mean, I understood how this deer died, and to get my head around it, that this was the person who had killed it, and was kind of glorified by these other men, like, oh, look, it just changed everything, my feeling for him. But it was like a wake-up call that people are not what they seem, and especially men. That
you had talked about the obsessions that are in this book with mothers, fathers. We'll get to tattoos. Can you talk briefly about that a little bit?
There's a lot of obsessions in the book. I mean,
yes.
I mean, I realized as I was writing it that I was there were things that were coming up and coming up and coming up, and I didn't necessarily think of them as obsessions, but there's an obsessive quality to much of the writing. And yeah, it shows up in swans, it shows up in men who, unfortunately surprise me, a little bit of protecting myself from these things, and mothers, there's about being a mother, having a mother, and all of that. There's a section in the book really about mothers and my mother's kind of progression into. So yeah.
There is a dream-like sense to the book, and as you said, these things are coming up, almost like stream of consciousness, which is a good thing. they all come out in swirling, different, overlapping ways. Thank you. I wanted to ask Kristin, you have an illustration for this poem. Could you talk about the deer body, because it has a face. Talk about the face on the body.
The deer hanging from the swing set, but I put a girl's face on the deer and some small breasts. And what I wanted to do is show not only the death of the deer, this tragic death of this beautiful animal, but also the death of her girl's, early infatuation with the neighbor man.
Yes.
How that just has lodged inside her and she never forgot it. So I merged the two deaths together in the one animal.
Thank you. It's very haunting.
Thank you.
Both together, you can't sort of get it out of your mind. Get the poem and the illustration out of your mind, which is the point. It's great. Tina, would you read Why Chinchilla is My Favorite Fur?
The last dress my mother bought while we still had money was gray wool, tight to the knees, the hips circled in chinchilla. She wore it to a wedding on a ship, a few fancy dinners, and when my father left, it became her date dress. Later, it served as part of a suit for work, worn under a jacket, as if she hid the animal beneath. When the seams frayed, she cut the fur from its dying host, hung it in the back of the closet. I'd sit in the airless dark, the pelt pressed to my face, inhaling its memory of rodent musk, whiff of seawater, and a scent I thought of as loneliness, the animals or mothers, I could never tell.
Beautiful. The sensuality in the whole book, as Tina, you're known to me. You are a fabulously sensual writer of poetry, and I think it's a great thing. And we need more of that in the poetry world, and you're providing it.
Thank you. I'm glad I'm doing my job.
You are. Would you read Why Mermaids Upset Me from section 2? Please read that for us. Thank you.
After we finish our hot dogs, my mother gives my sister and me a couple of dollars to buy cotton candy. Behind us in line, a man with a tattooed neck, a mermaid, finely drawn and delicately colored, catches me staring. I expect an indulgent smile, but his bugged out eyes mock me. His gaze travels from my face to my t-shirt and the flat chest beneath. When he reaches my ankles, he lingers on the lace-trimmed socks. Grimacing, he shakes his head, a small, intentional cruelty.
Ugh. It reminds me of my own emerging sexuality and teenagehood, and to have somebody look like that is a terrible thing. There's such a contrast between the man and the perfect mermaid tattoo that's on his skin. Did you this happened, I would imagine, perhaps it's very inventive. The speaker against the perfect mermaid tattoo. And it reminds me also, we talked about this before the show, the negative body image of the Russian folktale, the cruelty within that tale. Could you talk briefly about that?
Well, that myth, I think, unconsciously also shadows this little story. When I was thinking about this man, and I was thinking, what kind of tattoo? I mean, how would he try to attract a child? And I thought
Mm-hmm.
I always imagined him with tattoos, And my first thought was, the really old-fashioned kind of tattoos, the kind of crude tattoos that say mother, or Betty Boop kind of thing. But I imagined he would have a mermaid. And then I thought that he might have a mermaid that was actually very carefully drawn because he would want that attention. And so this child, which is what happens, this child in the book does. And, as a child, really, a child who's just kind of, transitioning into a little bit more of a tween, I guess you would call it now,
Yes.
and aware of her body, and that this man, instead of like smiling the way an adult would at a curious kid, looks at her in a way that's really creepily sexual, and also lets her know that she kind of repulses him.
Kristin, how did you work with these poems? Did you read this poem, for example, and then create the image, or did the two of you talk together before you, or both?
Tina would send me the poem, and I would copy them out longhand by hand in my sketchbook to really feel the words. And there's so many great images in Tina's poems. Wasn't hard for me to find imagery, to have it like come to my mind what was happening. And this poem especially, I could just feel that man. He just sprang like fully formed onto my sketchbook. I did sketches of everything before the final pieces, and he was just so easy for me to render. I knew him also. Tattoo, I did some tattoo research. Tina has a lot of tattoo books, so I did turn to her. And I loved making this very sexual woman hanging out on his shoulder with her breasts that obviously he had just like did this little visual survey of this young girl's flat chest, and to have the woman on his shoulder kind of confronting the young girl also, that they both stuck in her mind.
Thank you, Kristin. You're listening to Planet Poet Words in Space on WIOX Community Radio. I'm your host, Sharon Israel, and I'm here with writer Tina Barry and visual artist Kristin Flynn, here to discuss Tina's stunning new book, I Tell Henrietta. So how did the two of you find each other?
We actually first met in an art gallery at the show Tina had curated around Beautiful Raft.
Right.
Yeah, and so impressed with those poems. Those poems also let me give a shout out to Beautiful Raft, because that book is amazing.
It is.
It was so inventive and so good, such good work that she had curated into the show, that I was sort of like, wow, I want to know this person.
Oh.
And we live a few miles apart, and we just started reading each other's work and looking at each other's work and hanging out.
Yeah.
You're hanging out right now in the same room.
I mean, I liked her right away. There's just the easiness between us. And when I went to her studio, I saw her art and was just mesmerized by it. So good. She can render anything. And her color sense is so sophisticated. I just loved it. And of course, she's doing all these birds. Our obsessions kind of match.
Sure. Your obsessions matched. I love that. Tina, would you read Zeus again from I Tell Henrietta?
Something about the guy in the bar bothered me. He grinned too broadly, as if my comments charmed him, leaned in too close as I spoke, was too easy in my company. I said yes, though, when he invited me to a Halloween party. Going through my mother's closet weeks before, I discovered an old caftan in shades of neon rainbow and welcomed the opportunity to swish around in it. On the night of the party, I opened the door to discover him dressed as an enormous swan. The costume seemed so lifelike, the eye black, glittering, feathers aflutter. Whoa, I said, and tried to back away. But his wings closed around me, one webbed foot wedged in the door.
Ooh, that's Tina Barry reading Zeus again from I Tell Henrietta. So surreal.
Yeah. Some of the poems do kind of kind of move out of reality. And
Yes.
people have mentioned magical realism.
Hmm.
I like to let my imagination kind of just go with it. And there he was.
Yes, it was a Halloween party took on a very different dimension. I want to read something that Mary Biddinger, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, the author of the Department of Elegy, said about I Tell Henrietta. Tina Barry's astonishing collection explores thresholds between the dream world and wakefulness and between poetry and prose. So could you explain a little bit about your work? You talked about how it goes from the real to the surreal. Could you tell us a little bit how this is a hybrid form, Tina?
Um, yeah, that last poem, that one that I read. Yeah. Well, it's not. That's one of the pieces that I think really leans much more towards flash, um, or microfiction. Uh,
Hmm.
it 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 has a plot, a sort of a loose plot, but it has a plot. It has a beginning and a middle and an end, and there's a sort of the kind of moment. There's a little bit of an epiphany of sorts at the end. Where with prose poems, which is a form that I really love, and lineated poems, you can go in and out of time. You don't have to have a linear narrative um, flow to it, and especially with prose poems, you can real it the form itself encourages these kind of leaps into from time to time. It allows you to play in that way. So there's a lot of that in the book, and I like blending those borders.
Hmm.
I don't worry about them particularly when I'm writing. I just kind of let the piece go where it wants to, and then I say, oh, well, this is microfiction, or
That's right. I mean, that's the way to go, right? That's the way to do it. Also, the artwork of this for this particular poem, and I find it reminded me of Blake and Blake's um, mystical artwork.
Hmm. Yes, I made him a little more menacing with the black wings on, and not some. I didn't want him to be some kind of savior because I didn't feel that he was. And a man showing up at the door with big wings on could look sort of like an angel. You don't get a sense that this is particularly, I don't know, a lighthearted person. So I wanted him to have a very dark feeling uh, to his presence.
And I liked it. I think the figure, if I'm remembering, stands in its own a very empty space. There's no background to the figure, and that makes it a little unsettling also. So Tina, you're seeing that it makes so much sense in microfiction and flash fiction. There is some linear elements. There's a little narrative, and it goes sequentially in time. Whereas a prose poem or a lineated poem can be very dreamlike, and time play. You can play with the time, but you really take the reader into both. And it's not necessary for the reader, for me, to know exactly what you're doing.
I like the idea of when poems and prose poems where time is fluid, where it sort of works like you're quietly thinking, in the way a mind kind of is present, thinking of the present, remembering the memories of time. Um, and I like to play with that when I'm writing.
Thank you, Tina. Would you read for us the poem that comprises the epilogue of the book called "The Swan Returns"?
This is The Swan Returns, this time with a Russian accent. Before my daughter's wedding, a swan slides through the dark folds of a lake. Ducks feasting on breadcrumbs near the water's lips raise their heads and shriek. Two clouds join and darken. Anyone can see it's a sign. When the swan glides closer, I toss a hunk of bread that it snatches, then sails away like a feathered yacht. My mother told me a Russian folk tale about a mustached Tsarina, infamous for cruelty and terrible gifts. I've accidentally given some thoughtless presents, a wedge of cheddar to a lactose intolerant colleague, for a boyfriend, a birthday card addressed to my ex, to a dying relative, a plant that attracted swarms of flies. I can't beat the Tsarina, though, for originality. She hired artisans to carve a giant swan from ice, then forced a newly married couple to sleep in it. Long train trails behind my daughter's white gown. I'd say she looks like a swan, but I'm afraid to jinx her.
Oh, great poem. And that Russian folktale comes in. But I have to laugh at your foibles, the terrible things you did. Very droll. And it's nothing compared to with the Tsarina. But I love the personality. Your personality comes through and you make it so personal. And the anxiety that you don't want to jinx your daughter's wedding, but she looks like a swan. There's so much there. Could you talk about a little bit how the themes converge? The dark light of the swan, the promise of love, of hope, and anything else you'd like to say, Tina, about this?
Well, obviously, the folktale that I mentioned is very present in that poem. There's a lot of threads there that get tied up in that poem, and there's the love for my daughter, but also the understanding that darkness can come to people no matter how much you love them, how much you want to protect them. That there are omens out there that you can pay attention to, like the two clouds converging.
Mm,
Time, if you do that, if you are constantly looking for that, you lose the beauty, so at the end where I say, I see her, she looks like a swan, you know I don't want to jinx her. I don't want to think about what could be.
mm.
So those are kind of what the threads from that poem, the threads of the story that converge in that poem.
Oh, thank you. That was lovely explanation. So, what are upcoming events for both of you? I know that Aim Higher is a wonderful arm of the Poetry Barn and the magnificent Lissa Kiernan. Could you talk a little bit about Aim Higher and what's coming up next?
Aim Higher is a new-ish nonprofit, and among other things, they have a small press, and she is publishing poetry books. I'm very proud to be an Aim Higher author, and I think she did a magnificent job with this. She helped me do a lot of the editing, and we're both so grateful that you just embraced this project from the get-go, and gave us let us do what we were doing and published it. I also want to give a shout out to Jim Smith,
Yes.
who is a fabulous photographer who photographed the images, and to Shanna Compton, who is the book designer, who, the book is so elegant, I think, the way it flows. So, and she was also the one who turned the image on its side on the cover. I think it's brilliant that she did that, because it opened up. We were just like, there's so much type here. How are we going to get it all in? And she just, she just turned it and made that possible. But it's also, it kind of keys in a little bit to the oddness, and some of the surprises in the book. So I want to give all those people a shout out.
Great.
Coincidentally, I'm having a show coming up at the gallery where Tina and I met, Wired Gallery in High Falls on April 12th. So it'll be a show of new work of mine.
Great. Do you want to give out your websites or any links that our listeners may use?
Flynn.art,
Could you say that again, Kristen?
Kristin, Flynn, FLYNN.art is my website. And I can also be found on Instagram, Kristin Flynn Studio.
Great. And
Website tinabarrywriter.com. And the book is available through Aim Higher. You can go to their website and look at the book section, and it's there. Also on Barnes & Noble and the Odious Amazon.
I love the name, the Odious Amazon. It's almost like a poem, it's sort of a creature, which I won't say anything else. Let's end with another poem, a great poem that you wrote called I Married a Surfer.
Why I Married a Surfer. When my boyfriend and I walked into a bodega, the shop cat, mouse sated and snoozing, snapped its eyes open and followed us. At the end of the aisle, the cat hurled its heft onto a shelf where it stood eye level with my boyfriend. Something passed between them, some primal recognition I couldn't understand. The cat moved closer, so did he, and they touched noses. It wasn't the first time that kind of thing had happened. Once, as my love sat reading a book on the cement slab known as my backyard, a glittering of hummingbirds rose from behind the chain link fence, circled the sky. I was already smitten with his sun-streaked afro, the puka shell necklace nestled in the dip of his tanned neck, his burritos, carnitas. The only creature that had ever visited the backyard was an old crow that looked like the ragged remains of someone's Halloween costume. So the hummingbirds were a sign I couldn't ignore.
The cat, I don't know if this is true, but I want it to be true. And your lack of understanding of it is it's very poignant to me. I know I've been using that word a lot.
Well, it is a true story. And it's one of the reasons why I fell in love with my husband, who was a surfer. He hasn't surfed for a long time, but he grew up in California and surfed and was a good surfer, and was very exotic to me as a suburban New Jerseyite. And yeah, so he had this connection to animals. Cats would follow him, and it was just, there was something magical about him, and so that's what I tried to capture in that story.
You did. Tina Barry, Kristin Flynn, thank you so much for a beautiful show. I Tell Henrietta is a smashing book, and I recommend it if people are interested. You heard the websites. This has been a tremendous pleasure.
I'm sure
Me too.
both of us. Yeah, thank you so much, Sharon.
You're welcome.